So let's dive into the basic income rabbit hole again. And I do mean rabbit hole because there are very strong opinions on both sides. Not a lot of people in the middle on this particular topic. But let's start with some history and look at how that's maybe relating to our present time. So if we go back just 100 years ago, we saw how important horses' role was to our society. In other words, you would never think that they would be sort of put out of work. If you just go back 150 years ago, they were actually getting used more and more for transit purposes in many respects. And then fairly quickly, through mechanization processes, we made our motor vehicles, and those horses were soon mechanized. The muscle power of those horses were mechanized, and we soon had transport that did away with the need for horses. So the parallel here is, in many respects, in regards to computational processes and the human mind. In other words, it seems to be the case that computers are now getting more and more close to what's generally called general artificial intelligence. So there's been these cases of narrow artificial intelligence, and that generally is like maybe beating Garry Kasparov at chess, right? But a more general artificial intelligence does many of the processes of the human mind. So driving a motor vehicle in an automated fashion is getting quite close to a fairly general artificial intelligence. It can do a lot of different things. It needs to do a lot of different things to be able to do that. So as we edge closer into this automated world, more and more of the mind jobs, what it means to be human in the workplace, starts to be automated away. And so, historically we can look at it and say, oh, there's always been a place for people in the workforce. But in this case, those jobs are going to probably be weeded out. And unless we do cyborg stuff, that's probably not going to be a possibility to stay in that workforce, at least so these are real worries. And even if there's still a fair number of people in the workforce, there will be, it seems, a lot more unemployed. That's still controversial what I'm saying there, and it does probably need more background to really solidify that, but we'll just leave it at that. So that leaves us with sort of a need for upgrading potentially our economic and geopolitical worlds. And that those do, I think, tie quite tightly together. How our economy works. It's sometimes called a meritocracy, and that's achievement driven. You do good and you get rewarded for it historically. That ties quite tightly with how our geopolitics has tended to work, although it's moved into more of a pluralistic or relativistic context now. That just means, roughly speaking, that there's more multiculturalism, there's more kind of perspective taking, more sharing of data between executives and low-level people and etc. It's far more complicated than this, of course, but this is just a generalized, sometimes called an orienting generalization, which means I'm kind of just giving a broad slosh of information instead of touching on particulars. So this kind of drives us a little bit, unfortunately, nearing towards at least kind of conspiracy theory stuff, where we have perhaps 7 people controlling half of the world's wealth and these sorts of things. You could just say that that's a result of the meritocracy being pushed to its absolute limits, where indeed through these achievement processes, these ivory towers built, it allowed people to consolidate extraordinary amounts of wealth and power, and leaving not people desperate, but that gap between the rich and poor ever widening in the last 20 to 30 years. And this is a fairly novel or new kind of emergent. I won't go into it much deeper than that, but that's a thing that relates to potentially why the world debt is 327% the GDP at present. You could argue that that's how this has been somewhat designed to some degree. But so what are some solutions? Potentially, I would argue something like cryptocurrencies can play an integral role in decentralizing our economy and potentially down the road decentralizing our governance to some important extent. So some of the bigger ones, of course, that you'd probably know are Bitcoin, and another one that's emergent is Dash or Ethereum. So Bitcoin is a distributed ledger primarily focused on just monetary transactions. Ethereum adds a layer to it where you can do something called smart contracts, which is again on this distributed ledger, which means many, many computers are hooked up together. They're processing information. Ethereum can kind of add applications on that decentralized ledger. What I'm particularly interested in is something called IOTA. In regards to what I'm going to discuss here soon, and that's basic income. So IOTA is neat in that it has something called the DAG. And the DAG, unlike Bitcoin and Ethereum, which charge fees for transacting on the blockchain, and this isn't actually exactly a blockchain, but it's very close, the DAG doesn't. And what it does is it has, and I'm not an expert in this field, I'm just trying to suggest this might be a route out that we could use. So by confirming or computing two previous transactions, that makes up for the fee, in essence, that it would be charged to be part of the network. So it's actually it does a little bit of the processing like mining. So it kind of mines the data, and then it's supporting the network by not just doing one, but two transactions. So the network actually speeds up. If the DAG does work down the road, it's going to actually speed up and become more fluid, and is awesome for microtransactions. So think like the Internet of Things and these sorts of things. So this moves us into, and I'll integrate it in a moment, into basic income. So the worries that people have, and I'm just going to generalize, but some of the worries are that basic income would increase kind of a large ineffectual bureaucracy, where indeed kind of it promotes this kind of stagnant aspect of our geopolitical economic sphere, where it's not promoting achievement enough, and it's saying, okay, you can get by on the coattails of others, and this is kind of a real worry that we ought to have. And so the other side of this is kind of an insured employment. So I'm going to come back to that ineffectual bureaucracy in a moment, but the insured employment is a big thing that in the context of automation we have to think about, because there's going to be more and more people potentially being laid off. And even if they're not, even if we can find a way around this, I have some ideas of how this could potentially happen, but the probabilities to me are that more and more people will get laid off, and so having some sort of insured employment seems reasonable. But it has to be useful to society. So things like potentially caregiving or ecological renewal or even infrastructure, these things are potentially not financially invigorating, but they are integral to the social framework, to the social well-being of our connectivity between self, other, and our ecosystem. So that those invisible ties that bind, we don't want to lose those. We want to keep those strong to make sure that our society has a great deal of well-being and life standard and these sorts of things. But as I said, this large ineffectual bureaucracy is a real thing that we have to deal with, and it's kind of this notion of a voucher program. And you can kind of look at that, or some have, as sort of a Trojan horse, where in some important sense, this makes corporations, or allows them to exteriorize the costs of these sorts of things, where they can get the benefits of people buying their stuff, but they don't have to employ anybody. So one way around this is an integration possibility that I've thought about a bit, and it's kind of playing off or riffing off Bill Gates' idea, which I'm not necessarily a supporter of, but I do think this idea was worth noting. He said potentially we could tax the robots. Now, off the face of it, that might sound ridiculous, right? Taxing robots, how, why? But okay, imagine it this way. If we tax them, but that money didn't go directly to the government, rather, through IOTA, which is that DAG system, which is like the Internet of Things. It would allow from a blockchain on the Internet of Things. You could actually have these robots. So as automation happens, more and more robots and AI systems will be operational. So for every job displaced, you tax that at something 50, 70%. And then that 70% distributed through the DAG could be 0.000001 cent an hour per job that's displaced to every person in the nation or the planet. And then it builds up a basic income for people will want their jobs to be displaced because it creates a store of wealth for people that don't have to work. And corporations would want it too, although they'd of course want to hide the robots that they're taxing because that's of course. But you I don't know if you can enforce this. This is a squeaky area in my thinking, but it is important to think about more deeply. So if they were taxed through the DAG, 70%, 50%, everybody gets money distributed to them, then this makes the corporation shoulder some of the subsidy burden, as it were, the burden of the unemployment of these people, and it distributes it in I think a fairly holistic and healthy kind of way. I hope, be well.